Sometimes the most precious things in life come to us when we need them most. For 8-year-old Marigold, living with her grandfather in rural Nevada, that moment came when she spent her last $10 on something everyone else had forgotten. She bought an abandoned ghost town at auction, a place where tumbleweeds rolled down empty streets and wooden buildings stood like silent sentinels. With her dog Buck by her side, she explored her new kingdom, playing sheriff in a town time had left behind. But as she wandered through dusty rooms and creaking hallways, she began to feel she wasn't alone. Strange marks on the walls, an old pouch hidden under floorboards, and whispers in the wind told her this place held secrets. Someone had lived here once, someone like her, before something terrible happened. What dark truth had turned this thriving town into a place of silence and shadows? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the Nevada desert in shades of amber and gold as Marigold sat on the porch steps of her grandfather's weathered ranch house, carefully counting and recounting her $10 bill. At 8 years old, she possessed the kind of quiet wisdom that comes from too much loss too early. Her parents had died in a car accident 2 years ago, leaving her in the care of Grandpa Henry, a man whose gentle eyes held stories he rarely shared and whose hands bore the calluses of decades working unforgiving land. Buck, her loyal German Shepherd Mix, dozed in the shade beside her, one ear always alert for sounds of trouble or adventure. The dog had been her constant companion since the day she arrived at the ranch, as if he understood that this small girl needed a guardian who would never leave her side. His golden brown coat caught the morning light, and his intelligent brown eyes missed nothing that happened in their domain. "You sure about this, little sparrow?" Grandpa Henry asked, settling his aging frame into the rocking chair beside her. The nickname had stuck from her first week at the ranch, when she'd spent hours watching the small brown birds that nested in the eaves of the barn. Like them, she was small and quick, but also remarkably observant of the world around her. The auction notice had been tucked between bills and advertisements in yesterday's mail, a single sheet of paper announcing the sale of an abandoned town called Silver Creek, 40 miles north in the high desert. Most folks had overlooked it entirely, dismissing it as worthless land, too remote and barren to interest anyone. But something about the faded photograph of empty buildings and dust-swept streets had captured Marigold's imagination. "I've been saving this money for something special," she said, smoothing the crumpled bill against her knee. "Mama always said, money spent on dreams isn't money wasted." Henry's weathered face softened at the mention of his daughter. Margaret had possessed the same curious spirit, the same determination to see possibility where others saw only problems. It had led her to marry a traveling photographer and leave Nevada for the wider world, a decision that had broken Henry's heart even as he supported it. Now that same spirit lived on in this granddaughter who studied the world with such serious eyes. The drive to the auction took them through landscapes that seemed to exist outside of time. Red rock formations rose like ancient cathedrals from the desert floor, their surfaces carved by millions of years of wind and weather into fantastic shapes that fired the imagination. Sagebrush and desert grass stretched to the horizon, interrupted only by the occasional stand of Joshua trees, raising their twisted arms to the sky in permanent supplication. "Tell me again about Silver Creek," Marigold said, watching the scenery. Roll past through the pickup truck's dusty windows. Henry shifted uncomfortably behind the wheel. "Not much to tell, little sparrow. It was a mining town back in the 1800s. Silver played out, people moved on. That's the way of things in Nevada. Towns bloom and fade like desert flowers after rain." But there was something in his voice, a careful neutrality that didn't match the way his knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. Marigold had learned to read the adults around her with the precision of a desert tracker reading sign. Living with loss had taught her that people often said less than they knew, especially when memories carried weight they didn't want to bear. Buck sat alert in the truck bed, his nose raised to catch scents carried on the desert wind. Occasionally, he would whine softly, as if something in the air troubled him, but he never took his eyes off the road ahead. The auction was held in the parking lot of Freddy's Gas and General Store, a sun-faded building that served as the unofficial community center for scattered ranchers and desert dwellers. A handful of people had gathered around a folding table where County Clerk Mrs. Patterson shuffled through official-looking papers with the weariness of someone who had presided over too many failed dreams. Lot 17, the township of Silver Creek, she announced in a voice that suggested she expected no bids. 43 acres, including all structures and mineral rights. Opening bid is $5. Silence stretched across the small crowd. A few people shifted their feet and studied the ground, but no one raised a hand. Marigold felt her heart hammering as she clutched her $10 bill. $5, anyone? Mrs. Patterson tried again. These old mining towns have historical value, plenty of character for the right buyer. More silence. Someone in the back coughed. A rancher in a sweat-stained hat shook his head and muttered something about money pits to his companion. Going once, Mrs. Patterson said without enthusiasm. Marigold's hand shot up like a flag of surrender. $10! The clerk blinked in surprise, then looked around as if expecting someone to object or bid higher. When no one did, she nodded slowly. $10 to the young lady. Going once, twice, sold. The paperwork took longer than the auction. While Mrs. Patterson filled out forms and stamps, Marigold wandered around the parking lot with Buck at her side, trying to process the reality that she now owned an entire town. The deed, when it was finally handed to her, felt impossibly official, for something purchased with her allowance money. "You sure you know what you're getting into, child?" Mrs. Patterson asked, her stern expression softening with concern. "That place has been empty for 60 years. Nothing there but old buildings and hard memories." "Hard memories?" Marigold asked, but the clerk had already turned away to help the next person in line. The drive to Silver Creek took them deeper into the desert, following a dirt road that seemed to lead toward the edge of the world. The landscape grew more desolate with each mile, fewer plants, more rocks, and a silence so complete it seemed to press against their eardrums. Even the wind held its breath as they approached the ghost town. Silver Creek appeared gradually, emerging from the heat shimmer like something half-remembered from a dream. The main street ran straight as an arrow between two rows of wooden buildings, their false fronts still proudly declaring businesses that had closed before Marigold's grandparents were born. A saloon, a general store, a bank, a church, all the elements of a complete community, frozen in time and slowly surrendering to the desert's patient reclamation. Henry parked the truck at the edge of town and sat for a long moment, his hands still gripping the wheel. His face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan, and his breathing seemed shallow and careful. "Grandpa, are you okay?" He blinked and seemed to remember where he was. "Fine, little sparrow, it's been a long time since I've been up this way." They walked down the main street together, their footsteps echoing off the empty buildings. Buck trotted ahead, investigating doorways and corners with the systematic thoroughness of a professional scout. The air smelled of dust and old wood, with an underlying scent of something else, something that made Buck's hackles rise occasionally for no apparent reason. The saloon doors hung askew on rusted hinges, creaking softly in the desert breeze. Through the opening, Marigold could see overturned tables and chairs covered in decades of dust, and a bar that had once served drinks to miners celebrating their finds or drowning their sorrows. Sunlight, streaming through broken windows, painted patterns on the wooden floor, and somewhere in the building's depths, something creaked with the settling of old wood. "Can we go inside?" Marigold asked. Henry hesitated. "Maybe we should come back another day, when we're better prepared. Bring flashlights, maybe some tools to make the building safe." But Marigold was already pushing through the saloon doors, Buck padding beside her with his nose testing the air. The interior was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a high ceiling supported by hand-hewn beams. A staircase led to what had once been a second floor, though several steps were missing and the remaining ones looked dangerously rotted. At the far end of the room, behind the bar, hung a large mirror that had somehow survived decades of abandonment. Its silver backing was spotted with age, creating a mottled reflection that seemed to shimmer with its own light. When Marigold looked into it, she could almost imagine the room as it had been, filled with lamplight and conversation, the clink of glasses and the shuffle of cards. "This place was really alive once," she whispered, and her voice seemed to hang in the still air longer than it should have. Buck whined softly and pressed against her leg, his eyes fixed on something she couldn't see. The hair along his spine stood up, and his ears swiveled as if tracking sounds beyond human hearing. They explored 3 more buildings before the day grew too hot to continue. The general store still had shelves lined with empty jars and boxes, their labels faded beyond reading. The church retained its simple wooden pews and a cross carved from local wood, though birds had nested in the bell tower and left their calling. Cards across the floor. The bank, surprisingly, still had its massive safe standing open and empty in the back room, its door hanging wide as if to demonstrate that all treasures had long since been claimed. In each building, Buck displayed the same nervous alertness, staying close to Marigold while his senses tracked things that remained invisible to human perception. Once in the church, he barked sharply at an empty corner and wouldn't be coaxed closer despite Marigold's encouragement. As they prepared to leave, Marigold found herself reluctant to go, standing in the middle of the dusty street, looking at her town, she felt a connection she couldn't name. It wasn't just ownership, though the deed in her pocket proved that legal claim. It was something deeper, a sense of belonging that she hadn't felt since her parents died. "Grandpa, what really happened here?" Henry was loading their water bottles and tools back into the truck, moving with the careful efficiency of a man trying to stay busy. At her question, he paused and looked back at the empty buildings, his expression unreadable. "Like I said, little. Sparrow, the silver played out, people moved on. That's the way of boomtowns. But people don't just disappear overnight. Look at this place. It's like everyone just walked away and never came back. There are still dishes in the store, still books in the church. If the silver played out gradually, wouldn't people have taken their things?" Henry closed the truck's tailgate with more force than necessary. "Some stories are better left buried, Marigold. The past has a way of stirring up trouble for the present." As they drove away, Marigold turned in her seat to watch Silver Creek disappear into the heat. Shimmer. She was already planning their next visit, already imagining the stories those buildings might tell if she knew how to listen. Beside her, Buck had finally relaxed, but his ears remained alert, as if some part of him was still back in the ghost town, standing guard over secrets they had yet to discover. That night, as Marigold lay in her small bedroom under the eaves of the ranch house, she heard something that made her sit up straight in bed. It was Buck, whining softly by the window that faced north towards Silver Creek. When she joined him, she could see nothing but darkness and stars, but Buck's posture suggested he was seeing, or sensing, something far beyond the reach of human perception. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, stroking his fur. Buck looked up at her with eyes that seemed to hold a warning, then returned his attention to the window. Somewhere in the distance, carried on the desert wind, Marigold thought she heard something that might have been a child's voice, calling across the years for someone to finally listen to her story. The next morning brought Henry's revelation that changed everything. Marigold found him in his study, a small room lined with books and papers that he'd always kept private. The door stood open for the first time she could remember, and he sat at his desk with a leather-bound journal open before him. His face, it bore the expression of a man who had made a difficult decision and was prepared to live with the consequences. "Come in, little sparrow," he said without looking up. "I think it's time you knew the truth about Silver Creek." And about why your old grandpa's been carrying secrets he should have shared long ago. The leather journal felt warm under Henry's weathered hands as he opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. Marigold settled into the chair beside his desk, Buck curling at her feet with the patient alertness of a dog who sensed important. Conversations ahead. The morning light streaming through the study window illuminated dust motes dancing in the air like tiny spirits reluctant to settle. "This belonged to my father," Henry began, his voice carrying the weight of decades. He kept a record of his time in Silver Creek, back when it was still a living town. "I found it after he died, along with some other things that maybe should have stayed lost." The journal's pages were yellowed with age, covered in careful handwriting that spoke of a man who believed his words mattered. As Henry turned the pages, Marigold caught glimpses of dates from the 1890s, sketches of buildings she recognized, and names of people who had once walked the streets she now owned. "Your great-grandfather was the town's blacksmith," Henry continued. "A good man, by all accounts. Worked hard, treated people fairly, never asked for trouble." He paused at a particular entry, his finger tracing lines that had been written and rewritten, as if the author had struggled with how to record what he'd witnessed. "But even good men can find themselves caught up in things that shame them later." Before Marigold could ask what he meant, Buck's head snapped up. His attention focused on something outside the study door. His ears swiveled toward the front of the house, and a low whine escaped his throat. Not a warning exactly, but the sound of a dog recognizing something familiar that he couldn't quite place. "Grandpa, someone's coming," Marigold said, hearing the distant sound of a vehicle approaching on the ranch road. Henry closed the journal and moved to the window, his expression growing concerned as a dust cloud grew larger on the horizon. "Wasn't expecting anyone today," he muttered, then his face hardened. "That's Victor Steele's truck." The name meant nothing to Marigold, but the way Henry said it suggested she should pay attention. Through the window, she watched a gleaming black pickup truck approach their modest ranch house, its chrome bumpers and spotless paint job standing out like a sore thumb against the weathered landscape. Victor Steele proved to be a man who wore his wealth like armor, expensive boots that had never seen honest work, a cowboy hat that cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget, and a smile that never quite reached his calculating eyes. He stepped out of his truck with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through a combination of money and intimidation. "Henry Morrison," Steele called out as he approached the porch, his voice carrying the false heartiness of a salesman. "Been a while since we've had a chance to chat." Henry stepped outside to meet him, positioning himself between Steele and the house in a gesture that Marigold recognized as protective. Buck followed, his hackles raised and his body tense with the coiled alertness of a guard dog who didn't like what he smelled. "Victor," Henry replied with careful neutrality. "What brings you out this way?" Steele's gaze shifted to Marigold, who had followed them onto the porch, despite Henry's obvious preference that she stay inside. His smile widened in a way that made her skin crawl, like a predator recognizing easy prey. "Well now, this must be the little lady who caused such a stir at yesterday's auction," Steele said, his tone suggesting he found the entire situation amusing. "Buying herself a whole town with her allowance money. That's quite an investment for someone so young." "It's my town," Marigold said quietly, her hand finding Buck's fur for comfort. "I bought it fair and square." "Oh, I'm sure you did, honey," Steele replied, the endearment dripping with condescension. "But see, the thing about owning property is that it comes with responsibilities, taxes, maintenance, liability issues, a lot of complicated grown-up problems that might be too much for a little girl to handle." Henry stepped forward, his jaw set in the stubborn line that Marigold recognized as a warning sign. "Get to the point, Victor. The point is, I'm prepared to make a generous offer for that worthless piece of desert the child bought. $500. 50 times what she paid for it. That's good business by any measure." The offer hung in the air between them like a challenge. Marigold felt something cold settle in her stomach as she realized this man wanted to take away the one thing that had felt like hers since her parents died. But there was something else in his eagerness that struck her as wrong. Why would anyone pay 50 times the value for something they considered worthless? "It's not for sale," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. Steele's smile faltered for just a moment, revealing something harder underneath. "Now, little lady, I don't think you understand the situation. That town has been abandoned for 60 years. Nothing there but old buildings falling down and land that won't grow anything but weeds and regrets. What could a child possibly want with such a place?" "I want to explore it," Marigold replied honestly. "I want to learn about the people who lived there and why they left." The change in Steele's expression was subtle but unmistakable, a tightening around his eyes that suggested her words had struck a nerve. Henry noticed it too, his protective instincts sharpening as he moved closer to his granddaughter. "Some things are better left undisturbed," Steele said, his voice losing its false warmth. "Silver Creek has been dead and buried for good reason. Stirring up old history rarely does anyone any good." "Whose history?" Marigold asked, the question popping out before she could stop herself. For a moment, Steele looked as if he might say something he'd regret. Then his salesman's mask slipped back into place, and he reached into his shirt pocket for a business card that he held out to Henry. "Think about my offer," he said. $500 is more money than that little girl could spend in a year. Buy her something nice, something age-appropriate. Dolls, maybe, or pretty dresses. Leave the grown-up business to the grown-ups." Henry took the card but didn't look at it. "We'll consider it." "Don't consider too long," Steele replied, his tone carrying an undertone that might have been a threat. Property values in remote areas can be unpredictable. Sometimes what seems like a good investment turns out to be more trouble than it's worth. After Steele drove away, Henry stood on the porch for a long time, staring at the dust cloud that marked the man's departure. The business card crumpled in his fist, and Marigold could see the muscles in his jaw working as he fought with some internal struggle. Grandpa! What did he mean about stirring up old history? Henry turned to look at her, and for a moment, his careful mask slipped to reveal the fear underneath. "Some people have secrets they don't want uncovered, little sparrow. And some secrets are buried so deep that digging them up can be dangerous for everyone involved. But you said great-grandpa was a good man." "He was," Henry replied quietly. "But even good men can witness things they wish they hadn't, and carry guilt for things they couldn't prevent." That afternoon, against Henry's obvious reluctance, they returned to Silver Creek. This time, Marigold came prepared with a flashlight, a notebook, and a determination to understand what made both her grandfather and Victor Steele so nervous about an abandoned town. The ghost town looked different in the afternoon light, less mysterious perhaps, but more real. The buildings cast sharp shadows that revealed details she'd missed during their first visit. Intricate woodwork on the church, eaves, hand-forged hinges on the saloon doors, and windows that had been carefully boarded from the inside, rather than simply left to break. "Someone took care when they closed this place up," Marigold observed, running her fingers along boards that had been nailed with precision and painted to match the building's original color. Henry nodded reluctantly. "The last families to leave were careful people. They hoped someday others might want to return." Buck had resumed his nervous behavior the moment they entered the town, staying close to Marigold while his senses tracked things beyond human perception. In the saloon, he whined and pawed at a particular section of flooring near the bar, his attention focused with the intensity of a hunting dog on a strong scent. "What is it, boy?" Marigold asked, kneeling beside him. The floorboards Buck was investigating looked different from the others, newer somehow, though still aged by decades. When Marigold pressed on them, they gave slightly, as if the nails had loosened over time. Using a loose piece of wood as a lever, she managed to pry up one of the boards. Underneath, in a hollow space between the floor joists, lay a small leather pouch, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth. The pouch was decorated with intricate beadwork. in patterns that seemed to tell a story. Birds and stars and running water worked in colors that had faded but not disappeared entirely. Henry's sharp intake of breath told her this was significant before she could examine the pouch's contents. Marigold, put that back, but Grandpa, put it back, now. The urgency in his voice stopped her, but not before she'd glimpsed what the pouch contained. Small carved figures, a braid of dark hair, and something that glinted like silver in the flashlight's beam. As she reluctantly rewrapped the pouch and placed it back in its hiding place, she noticed Buck's behavior had intensified. He was no longer just alert. He was trembling, his eyes fixed on a point near the saloon's back entrance, where nothing visible stood. "Someone's here," he seemed to be saying with every fiber of his being. "Someone who's been waiting a very long time for this moment." That night, Marigold lay awake, listening to the desert wind and thinking about the fear she'd seen in both Henry's eyes and Victor Steele's false smile. The leather pouch haunted her thoughts, not just its existence, but the careful way it had been hidden and Henry's panicked reaction to her finding it. Sometime after midnight, Buck began whining again by the window. When Marigold joined him, she saw something that made her heart race. A faint light flickering in the distance, right where Silver Creek lay hidden in the desert darkness. It pulsed like a heartbeat, regular and deliberate, as if someone was sending a signal across the years. "Someone's there," she whispered to Buck, who pressed against her leg with a whine that sounded almost like agreement. The light flickered 3 more times, then vanished, leaving only the star-filled darkness of the Nevada night. But Marigold had seen enough to know that Silver Creek's secrets were calling to her, and that tomorrow she would have to choose between the safety of ignorance and the dangerous path of truth. In the distance, carried on the desert wind, she thought she heard something that might have been a child's voice, singing a lullaby in a language she didn't recognize but somehow understood. The song spoke of loss and longing, of promises broken and justice delayed, and of a small girl who had been waiting far too long for someone brave enough to listen to her story. The Pine Valley Public Library occupied a low brick building that had seen better decades, but librarian Mrs. Henderson maintained it with the fierce devotion of someone who understood that knowledge was a community's most precious resource. Marigold pushed through the heavy wooden doors with Buck at her side, the library being one of the few public buildings in Nevada that welcomed well-behaved dogs and breathed in the familiar scent of old books and learning. "Well, if it isn't our newest property owner," Mrs. Henderson said with a warm smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. At 63, she possessed the kind of practical intelligence that came from decades of helping people find answers to questions they sometimes couldn't even properly articulate. "I heard through the grapevine that you made quite an investment yesterday." "I bought Silver Creek," Marigold said, the words still feeling strange in her mouth. "I was hoping you might have some information about its history." Mrs. Henderson's expression grew more serious, though not unkind. "Silver Creek. Now there's a name I haven't heard spoken aloud in quite some time. Most folks around here prefer to let sleeping dogs lie, if you catch my meaning." She led Marigold to a section of the library devoted to local history, where filing cabinets and bound volumes held the memories of communities scattered across the desert. Buck settled beside a reading table with the patient alertness of a dog, accustomed to quiet spaces and long research sessions. "What exactly are you looking to learn?" Mrs. Henderson asked, pulling out a chair for Marigold. "Everything," Marigold replied honestly. "Who lived there, what they did, why they left. My grandfather says the silver played out, but something about that town feels unfinished." Mrs. Henderson nodded slowly, as if the word unfinished resonated with her own understanding. She disappeared into the stacks and returned with several bound volumes of old newspapers, a folder thick with photocopied documents, and a manila envelope that she handled with particular care. The Pine Valley Gazette covered Silver Creek fairly, regularly in the 1880s and 90s. she explained, opening the first volume. It was a prosperous little community for about 15 years. Silver mining, yes, but also cattle ranching and some farming. People built real lives there, not just the temporary camps you see in some boom towns. The newspaper pages revealed a community that had indeed thrived. Advertisements for Morrison's blacksmith shop, her great-great-grandfather's business, appeared regularly alongside notices for church socials, school programs, and town council meetings. There were birth announcements and wedding notices, reports of successful mining claims, and photographs of families gathered for community celebrations. "Look at this," Marigold said, pointing to a photograph dated September 1893. It showed a group of children outside the Silver Creek schoolhouse, their faces solemn in the formal way of old portraits. In the back row stood a girl who couldn't have been much older than Marigold herself, with dark braids and eyes that seemed to look directly at the camera, and somehow through time itself. That would be during the time when Silver Creek was fully integrated, Mrs. Henderson observed. Not all Western towns were so progressive, but Silver Creek had families from many different backgrounds, living and working together peacefully. Integrated how? Well, you had the European miners and ranchers, of course, but also Mexican families who'd been in the area since before it was part of the United States. And there was a small but well-respected Native American family who served as guides and interpreters for the mining operations. Mrs. Henderson paused, her finger hovering over the photograph. The Windwalker family, if I recall correctly. They had a daughter about the age of that girl in the back row. Buck's head lifted suddenly, his attention focused on something beyond. The library windows. His ears swiveled toward the street, and a soft whine escaped his throat, the same sound he'd made at Silver Creek when his senses picked up things beyond human perception. What happened to them? Marigold asked, though part of her already suspected the answer wouldn't be happy. Mrs. Henderson's expression grew troubled as she turned to the next section of newspapers, dated from late 1893 and early 1894. The headlines grew increasingly. Ominous, tension rising in mining district, reports of missing livestock, and finally, in stark black letters, tragedy strikes Silver Creek, town evacuated. The article that followed was frustratingly vague, speaking of unfortunate incidents and community safety concerns without providing specific details about what had actually happened. But between the lines, Marigold could read a story of fear and conflict that had torn apart what had once been a peaceful community. The official records are incomplete, Mrs. Henderson said carefully. But there are other sources. She opened the manila envelope and withdrew a collection of photographs, letters, and documents that appeared to be from private collections rather than official archives. Among them was a small wooden doll, carved with intricate detail and wearing a tiny dress made from scraps of real fabric. This belonged to one of the children who lived in Silver Creek, Mrs. Henderson explained. Her family donated it to the Historical Society, along with these other items, hoping someday someone might be interested in preserving the town's memory. The doll was beautiful in the way that handmade toys often are. Not perfect, but created with obvious love and attention. Its face had been painted with delicate features, and its yarn hair was arranged in two small braids that reminded Marigold of the girl in the photograph. "May I hold it?" she asked. The moment her fingers touched the wooden figure, something strange happened. The library seemed to fade around her, and for just an instant she could almost see Silver Creek as it had been. Alive with voices and activity, children playing in the dusty streets, while adults went about the business of building a community. She could hear laughter and conversation, the ring of hammer on anvil from her great-great-grandfather's shop, and somewhere in the distance, a song being sung in a language she didn't recognize, but somehow understood. Buck's sharp bark brought her back to the present. He was on his feet, staring at the library's front windows with his hackles raised. Through the glass, Marigold could see Victor Steele's black pickup truck parked across the street, its chrome bumpers glinting in the afternoon sun like watching eyes. "Seems you've attracted some attention," Mrs. Henderson observed dryly. "Victor. Steele doesn't usually spend time in the library district. He wants to buy Silver Creek from me," Marigold explained. "He offered $500. $500 for a ghost town?" Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose. "That's interesting. Victor Steele has never been known for his generosity, especially when it comes to property that most people would consider worthless." As they watched, Steele climbed out of his truck and approached the library with the purposeful stride of a man on a mission. Mrs. Henderson quickly gathered the photographs and documents, slipping them back into the manila envelope. "Take this. With you," she said quietly, pressing the envelope into Marigold's hands along with the wooden doll. "But be careful who you show it to. Some people prefer that certain stories stay buried." Steele pushed through the library doors with less courtesy than most patrons, his expensive boots clicking on the polished floor. His smile was as artificial as the day before, but his eyes held a harder edge that suggested his patience was wearing. "You thin. Afternoon, ladies," he said, his gaze moving from Mrs. Henderson to Marigold with calculating interest. "Doing a little historical research, are we?" "Education is never a waste of time, Mr. Steele," Mrs. Henderson replied, with the calm authority of someone who had dealt with difficult patrons for decades. "Oh, I couldn't agree more," Steele said, his attention focused on the materials scattered across the reading table. "Though sometimes too much education about certain subjects can be problematic, especially for impressionable young minds." "I'm just learning about my town," Marigold said, tucking the envelope and doll protectively against her chest. "You're a town," Steele repeated, his tone suggesting he found the concept amusing. "You know, little lady, ownership comes with responsibilities. And sometimes those responsibilities can be dangerous for someone who doesn't understand what they're dealing with." Buck growled low in his throat, a sound that made both women look at him in surprise. The dog was normally gentle and quiet, but something about Steele clearly triggered his protective instincts. "I think we're done here for today," Mrs. Henderson said smoothly, beginning to clear the remaining materials from the table. "Marigold, why don't you take Buck outside for some fresh air? I'll finish organizing these resources for you." As they left the library, Marigold noticed Steele didn't follow immediately. Through the windows, she could see him talking intently with Mrs. Henderson, his body language suggesting the conversation was more serious than his usual false charm would indicate. Buck remained alert and focused during the drive home, his attention split between watching the road ahead and keeping track of any vehicles that might be following them. Twice, he turned to look back through the truck's rear window, whining softly, as if he sensed pursuit that remained invisible to human eyes. That evening, in the safety of Henry's study, Marigold examined the contents of Mrs. Henderson's envelope more carefully. The photographs revealed Silver Creek as a thriving community, where people of different backgrounds had indeed lived and worked together. The letters, written in various hands and languages, spoke of shared celebrations, cooperative business, ventures, and the kind of neighborly support that builds strong communities. But it was the wooden doll that held her attention most powerfully. Each time she held it, she experienced the same strange sensation of connection, as if the toy held memories that were eager to be shared with someone willing to listen. "Grandpa," she said, showing Henry one of the photographs, "look at this. The girl in the back row, doesn't she look like someone who might have owned this doll?" Henry studied the image for a long moment, his expression growing increasingly troubled. When he looked up, his eyes held the weight of recognition and old grief. "Her name was Star That Falls," he said quietly. "And yes, that doll probably belonged to her. She was the reason Silver Creek died." The Silver Creek schoolhouse stood apart from the other buildings, positioned on a small rise that gave it a commanding view of the entire town. Its bell tower still reached toward the sky with dignified purpose, though the bell itself had long since fallen silent. Marigold approached it with the wooden doll tucked carefully in her jacket pocket, Buck padding beside her with his usual vigilant awareness of their surroundings. The schoolhouse door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the morning breeze. Inside, rows of wooden desks still faced a blackboard, where chalk dust had settled into permanent patterns. Sunlight streaming through dirty windows illuminated a room that seemed frozen in time. Books still stacked on shelves, a world map hanging askew on one wall, and children's artwork pinned to a bulletin board where the colors had faded to pale ghosts of their original brightness. But it was the teacher's desk that drew Marigold's attention. In its bottom drawer, she found something that made her heart race. A small silver locket, tarnished with age, but still bearing intricate engravings around its oval surface. When she pressed the tiny clasp, it opened to reveal two photographs, one of the Native American girl from the school picture, and beside it, a blonde girl with serious eyes and a determined chin. "Star that falls and her friend," Marigold whispered, understanding flooding through her as she studied the faces. These weren't just classmates. Their positioning in the locket suggested a deep friendship, the kind of bond that transcends the surface differences adults often focus on. Buck whined softly and moved toward the schoolhouse's back corner, where a small alcove had once served as a coat-room. His behavior had grown increasingly agitated since they'd entered the building, as if he sensed presences that remained invisible to human eyes. Following Buck's lead, Marigold discovered that the alcove contained more than just empty coat hooks. Hidden behind a loose board was a collection of items that spoke of childhood secrets and treasured friendships. Pressed flowers, carefully folded notes written in two different hands, and small gifts that girls might exchange as tokens of their bond. Among these treasures was a letter written in the careful script of someone for whom English was not a first language. "My dear Annie, today Father says we may have to leave Silver Creek soon. He will not tell me why, but I see the worry in his eyes and hear the whispered conversations that stop when I enter the room. If we must go, I want you to know that you are the sister of my heart, and distance cannot break the bond we have made. Keep the shell I gave you, and when the moon is full, hold it to your ear. The ocean will sing to you the same song it sings to me, and we will know we are connected across any distance. Your friend always, Star that falls." Marigold sank into one of the small desk chairs, the letter trembling in her hands. Here was proof that the peaceful integration Mrs. Henderson had described was real. These two girls had formed a friendship that crossed cultural lines in a way that must have been remarkable for its time. But what had forced Star that falls and her family to consider leaving? And why had the departure apparently been so sudden that personal treasures were left hidden in secret places? The sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted her thoughts. Through the schoolhouse windows, she could see Henry's pickup truck making its way up the main street, but behind it followed another vehicle. Victor Steele's black truck, maintaining a careful distance, but clearly tracking their movements. Henry entered the schoolhouse with an expression that mixed relief at finding her safe with obvious anxiety about their situation. "We need to go, little sparrow. Now." "But Grandpa, look what I found." "I said now, Marigold." The urgency in his voice brooked no argument. Marigold quickly gathered the locket and letter, sensing that whatever had Henry frightened was serious enough to warrant immediate compliance. Buck seemed to agree, pressing against her leg with the nervous energy of a guard dog who detected multiple threats converging on their position. As they prepared to leave, Steele's truck pulled up beside the schoolhouse. The man who emerged was different from the smooth-talking businessman of their previous encounters. His expensive clothes were dusty, his usually perfect hair showed signs of stress, and his eyes held the hard glitter of someone whose patience had finally snapped. "Afternoon, Henry," he called out, his voice carrying across the empty street with false casualness. "Thought I might find you folks up here playing in the ruins." "We're just leaving," Henry replied, positioning himself protectively between Steele and Marigold. "Are you? That's a shame. I was hoping we might have a more serious conversation about my offer. You see, circumstances have changed, and I'm afraid my generosity has limits." Steele reached into his truck and withdrew a manila folder thick with official-looking documents. "I've done some research of my own, Henry. Turns out that little girl's purchase might not be as ironclad as she thinks. There are questions about the original land grants, issues with mineral rights, problems that could tie up ownership in court for years." "What kind of problems?" Henry asked, though his voice suggested he already suspected the answer. "The kind that could cost a family their ranch if they found themselves on the wrong side of an expensive legal battle. The kind that might force an old man to sell everything he's worked for just to pay attorney fees." Steele's smile returned, cold and calculating. "Of course, all those problems would disappear if we could reach a reasonable agreement about Silver Creek." Marigold felt anger flare in her chest, hot and protective. This man was threatening her grandfather, using legal manipulation to steal what she had legitimately purchased. But beneath the anger was something else, a growing sense that Steele's desperation to acquire Silver Creek had less to do with its potential value and more to do with keeping its secrets buried. "Why do you want it so badly?" she asked, stepping out from behind Henry despite his protective gesture. "What's really in Silver Creek that's worth threatening people over?" Steele's mask of false civility finally cracked completely. "Sometimes little girls ask too many questions for their own good. Sometimes they dig up things that should stay buried, and sometimes they learn that the adult world has consequences a child's mind can't comprehend." Buck growled low in his throat, a sound that made all three humans look at him in surprise. The dog's attention wasn't focused on Steele, however. It was directed toward the empty street behind them, as if he sensed the approach of something that remained invisible to human perception. "We're leaving," Henry said firmly, taking Marigold's hand, "and we won't be back." But even as they walked toward their truck, Marigold knew her grandfather's promise was one he wouldn't be able to keep. The locket in her pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, and the letter from Star That Falls felt like a sacred trust she couldn't abandon. Whatever secrets Silver Creek held, whatever had driven a peaceful community to sudden evacuation, she was now part of the story, whether she wanted to be or not. As they drove away, she turned for one last look at the schoolhouse where two young girls had once pledged eternal friendship. In the window of the building, just for a moment, she thought she saw a face, a girl with dark braids and eyes that seemed to look directly at her across the years, as if Star That Falls herself was, watching and waiting for someone brave enough to honor the promises that had been broken so long ago. That evening, Marigold sat in her bedroom with the locket open before her, studying the faces of the two friends whose bond had survived whatever tragedy befell Silver Creek. The blonde girl, Annie, according to the letter, looked back at her with eyes that seemed to hold their own secrets and sorrows. On impulse, she opened her laptop and began searching genealogy websites, using the name Annie and the approximate dates from the school records Mrs. Henderson had shown her. What she found made her breath catch in her throat. Annie Patterson had indeed lived in Silver Creek, the daughter of a mining engineer who had arrived in 1891. But according to the records, Annie had died in Silver Creek in December 1893 at the age of 9. The same month the newspapers had reported the mysterious tragedy that led to the town's evacuation. Star That Falls and her friend Annie hadn't been separated by distance and circumstance. They had been separated by death itself, and something about that separation had been traumatic enough to drive an entire community away from their homes and livelihoods. Buck whined softly from his place by the window, his attention focused once again on the darkness that hid Silver Creek from view. But tonight there was no mysterious light flickering in the distance. Instead, Marigold sensed something else, a feeling of expectation, as if the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to make a choice between safety and truth. The wooden doll sat on her nightstand, its painted eyes seeming to watch her with patient hope. In her pocket, the locket grew warm against her palm, and she could almost hear Star That Fall's voice, carried on the night wind, calling across the years for someone to finally discover what had really happened to her and her beloved friend in the winter of 1893. The Pine Valley County Courthouse occupied a brick building that had witnessed more than its share of human drama over the decades. In its basement archives, beneath fluorescent lights that hummed with electrical persistence, Marigold found herself, surrounded by boxes of legal documents that might hold answers to the questions multiplying in her mind. Mrs. Henderson had arranged access through her connections with the county clerk's office, understanding that some mysteries required official documentation to unravel. Property disputes from the 1890s, the elderly clerk had explained, while leading them through narrow corridors lined with filing cabinets. Most folks don't bother with records this old, but everything's still here if you know where to look. Buck waited patiently upstairs in the courthouse lobby, his presence a calming reminder that she wasn't entirely alone in this investigation. Henry had reluctantly agreed to let her pursue her research, though his worried expression suggested he feared what she might discover. The document she sought proved to be buried in a box labeled Land Grants and Mineral Rights, 1880-1900. The pages were yellowed and brittle, requiring careful handling, but the legal language was clear enough once she worked through the formal terminology. The Windwalker family, Star That Falls people, had held legitimate title to a significant portion of the land that later became Silver Creek, granted through a treaty that predated the mining boom by several years, but attached to their original. Land grant was another document, torn along one edge, as if someone had tried to remove it from the file. What remained was a fragment of a later agreement, dated November 1893, that appeared to transfer the Windwalker holdings to a mining consortium. The signatures at the bottom were partially obscured by water damage, but one name was still legible: Cornelius Steele. Victor Steele's great-grandfather, Marigold whispered, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a disturbing picture. The transfer document raised more questions than it answered. Why would the Windwalker family, who had lived peacefully in the area for years, suddenly sell their ancestral holdings? And why was the document torn, as if someone had later tried to remove evidence of the transaction? Her research was interrupted by the courthouse clerk, who appeared at her elbow with an expression of polite concern. "Miss Morrison, there's a gentleman upstairs asking to speak with you, says it's urgent." Marigold's heart sank, expecting to find Victor Steele waiting in the lobby. Instead, she discovered an elderly Native American man seated on one of the wooden benches, his weathered hands folded over a walking stick carved with intricate symbols. His long grey hair was braided with beaded ties, and his dark eyes held the kind of deep wisdom that comes from decades of careful observation. "You must be the little girl who owns Silver Creek now," he said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. "I am Joseph Crowfeather, and I've been waiting a long time to speak with someone who cares about that place." Buck approached the old man with none of his usual wariness, tail wagging as if greeting an old friend. Joseph's weathered face creased into a smile as he scratched behind the dog's ears. "Animals know things we forget," he observed. "Your Buck understands that some places hold memories too strong to fade, even after many years. Did you know Star That Falls?" Marigold asked, settling onto the bench beside him. "She was my great-aunt's daughter," Joseph replied, his expression growing serious. "A bright child, curious about the world beyond our small community. She wanted to learn everything: English, mathematics, the stories of the mining families who shared our valley. Her friendship with the Patterson girl was unusual for that time, but both families supported it." "What happened to them?" Joseph was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on his walking stick as if drawing strength from its carved symbols. When he spoke, His voice carried the weight of inherited sorrow. There are different versions of that story, depending on who tells it. The official version says there was an accident, a tragic misunderstanding that led to fear and conflict between the communities. But my great-aunt told a different story before she died, one that was never written down in your courthouse records. He reached into a worn leather bag and withdrew a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. Inside was another fragment of official documentation, but this one was written in careful script that seemed to glow with authority under the courthouse's harsh lighting. This is part of the original treaty that granted my family our land rights. See these signatures? They represent a legal agreement that was supposed to last forever, or at least until the mountains crumble and the rivers run backward. The document he showed her matched the torn fragment she'd found in the archives, but this piece contained additional language that changed everything. The treaty didn't just grant land rights to the Windwalker family, it also established them as legal guardians of certain sacred sites that fell within the Silver Creek area, with specific protections that could never be legally transferred or sold. If this is authentic, Marigold said, studying the official seals and signatures, then the land transfer I found in the archives was illegal. More than illegal, Joseph replied gravely. It was obtained through fraud and violence, and those who participated knew exactly what they were doing. He rewrapped the treaty fragment with careful reverence, but not before Marigold noticed something that made her pulse quicken. At the bottom of the document, listed as a witness to the original agreement, was a familiar name, Morrison Blacksmith. Her great-great-grandfather hadn't just worked in Silver Creek. He had been present at the signing of the treaty that was later violated, which meant Henry's family had known all along about the legal theft that drove Star That Falls and her people from their ancestral home. Mr. Crowfeather, she said carefully, what really happened to Star That Falls and Annie? The old man's expression grew troubled, and he glanced around the courthouse lobby as if checking for listeners who might overhear dangerous truths. Come with me, he said, rising slowly with the aid of his walking stick. There are places where such stories should be told, and this building has heard enough lies over the years. It's time you learned the truth about Silver Creek, all of it, no matter how much it might hurt to hear. As they left the courthouse together, Marigold noticed a black pickup truck parked across the street, its chrome bumpers glinting in the afternoon sun like watching eyes. Victor Steele sat behind the wheel, his attention focused on their small group with the intensity of a predator tracking prey. Buck growled low in his throat, the hair along his spine rising as his instincts recognized a threat that extended beyond simple business disagreements. Whatever truth Joseph Crowfeather was prepared to share, it was clearly something that Victor Steele would go to great lengths to keep buried. Don't look back, Joseph advised quietly, guiding them toward his own modest truck parked in the courthouse's rear lot. Some secrets have been protected by fear for so long that those who profit from the lies will fight desperately to keep them hidden. But you've already gone too far to turn back safely now, young one. The only way forward is through the truth, no matter where it might lead. As they drove away from the courthouse, Marigold realized she was no longer just investigating a historical mystery. She had become part of an ongoing struggle between justice and greed, truth and concealment, that had been raging for more than a century. The wooden doll in her pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, and the silver locket felt heavy with the weight of promises that had yet to be fulfilled. Behind them, Victor Steele's truck fell into line, maintaining a careful distance, but clearly intent on following wherever their investigation might lead them next. The Silver Creek Church had been built with more ambition than the town's size warranted, its bell tower reaching toward heaven with the kind of optimism that comes from communities who believe their prosperity will last forever. Joseph Crowfeather led Marigold and Buck through the empty sanctuary, his walking stick tapping against wooden floors that had once echoed with hymns and prayers in several languages. The Patterson family attended services here, he explained, his voice reverent in the sacred space. Annie was part of the children's choir, along with Star That Falls. Their voices blended beautifully, my great-aunt used to say, one high and sweet, the other rich and strong, creating harmonies that made the adults weep with joy. Sunlight filtering through stained glass windows cast rainbow patterns across the pews, and somewhere in the building's depths, old wood settled with soft creaks that sounded almost like whispered conversations. Buck remained alert, but calm, his usual nervousness around Silver Creek's buildings replaced by the respectful stillness of a creature who recognized holy ground. Joseph approached the altar with measured steps, then turned toward a narrow staircase that led up to the bell tower. The children used to play up there sometimes when the weather was too harsh for outdoor games. They left things behind, small treasures they thought would be safe in God's house. The climb to the bell tower was steep and dusty, but worth the effort. In a corner where sunlight slanted through gaps in the wooden walls, Marigold discovered a small cache of items that told the story of two girls whose friendship had transcended the social barriers of their time. There were pressed flowers carefully preserved between pieces of glass, small stones polished smooth by countless handlings, and most precious of all, a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The letters were written in two distinctly different hands, one showing the careful penmanship taught in frontier schools, the other flowing with the natural grace of someone for whom writing was both communication and art. As Marigold read them, the friendship between Star That Falls and Annie came alive with startling immediacy. "My dearest Star," read one letter. In Annie's careful script, "Father says there are men coming from the territorial capital to examine our mining claims. He seems worried, though he tries not to show it. Mother has been baking extra bread and checking our supplies as if we might. Need to leave quickly. I hope we don't have to go anywhere. I cannot imagine Silver Creek without you, or my life without our friendship." Star That Falls' reply was written in flowing script that managed to be both elegant and urgent. "Beloved Annie, Father speaks with the elders every night now, and their voices carry the weight of great concern. He says there are papers that challenge our right to live in the valley our people have called home for generations. But worse than the threat to our land is the fear I see growing in some of the mining families. Yesterday, Mrs. Coleman crossed the street to avoid speaking with Mother at the general store. Fear makes people do terrible things, my friend. Promise me that whatever happens, you will remember that our hearts know no difference between your people and mine." The final letter in the bundle was dated December 10th, 1893, just days before the mysterious tragedy that had emptied Silver Creek forever. It was written in Annie's hand, but the careful penmanship had devolved into frantic scrawls that spoke of terror and desperate urgency. "Star, they are coming tonight. Mr. Steele has convinced some of the miners that your family is hiding silver that rightfully belongs to the consortium. He says the missing ore from the western claims must be in your people's possession, and that the territorial authorities will support whatever action is necessary to recover it." Father tried to reason with them, but they are beyond listening. To voices of sanity, "You must take your family and leave immediately. Go to the sacred caves your grandmother showed us last summer and wait until this madness passes. I will try to delay them as long as possible, and I will find you when it is safe. Your sister always, Annie." Marigold's hands trembled as she read the final letter. Here was the truth that had been buried for more than a century. Star That Falls and her family had been driven from their home by a violent conspiracy, led by Cornelius Steele, who had used false accusations of theft to justify what amounted to armed robbery disguised as law enforcement. "They didn't just leave," she whispered, the horror of it settling over her like a cold shroud. "They were forced out by lies and threats." Joseph nodded gravely, his weathered face reflecting the pain of inherited memory. "And Annie Patterson died trying to protect them." She delayed the mob long enough for Star That Falls family to escape, but she paid for that courage with her life. How did she die? The official story says she fell from a horse while riding in the dark, struck her head on rocks near the creek. But my great-aunt was there that night, hiding with Star That Falls in the cave system beyond the town. They heard the gunshots, saw the flames from buildings that were torched to drive people out. Annie didn't fall from a horse. She was murdered for standing between greed and innocent people. Buck whined softly and moved toward the bell tower's windows, his attention focused on something outside. Through the dusty glass, Marigold could see Victor Steele's truck parked at the edge of town, its occupant clearly waiting for them to emerge. From their investigation, "He knows we're getting close to the truth," she observed, a chill running down her spine as she realized how dangerous their situation had become. "The Steele family has been protecting their secret for 5 generations, Joseph replied. "They built their wealth on land, stolen through fraud and violence, and they've used that wealth to ensure the real story never came to light. Victor Steele isn't just trying to buy Silver Creek. He's trying to destroy the last evidence that could expose his family's crimes." As they prepared to leave the bell tower, Joseph handed Marigold one more item he had kept hidden until now, a small leather journal bound with sinew and decorated with the same intricate beadwork that had adorned Star That Falls' medicine pouch. "This belonged to my great-aunt. She wrote down everything she witnessed that night, everything Star That Falls told her about the friendship she shared with Annie Patterson. She made me promise that someday, when the right person came along, I would share this testimony so that both girls could finally receive the justice they deserved." The journal felt heavy in Marigold's hands, not with physical weight, but with the accumulated sorrow and hope of generations who had waited for someone brave enough to hear their story. As she opened it, the pages seemed to whisper with voices that had been silenced for far too long. "What do we do now?" she asked, understanding that she had crossed a line from which there could be no safe retreat. Joseph's expression was grim but determined. "Now we finish what those 2 brave girls started more than a century ago. We make sure the truth finally comes to light, no matter what it costs us." As they descended from the bell tower, Marigold realized that her childhood had effectively ended the moment she opened that first letter. She was no longer just a curious 8-year-old playing at being a detective. She was now the keeper of secrets that powerful people would kill to protect, and the only hope for justice that Star That Falls and Annie had left in the world. Behind them, the church's stained glass windows caught the afternoon light and painted rainbow patterns across walls that had witnessed the beginning of a friendship powerful enough to survive death itself. And somewhere in the desert wind that whistled through the empty town, Marigold thought she could hear 2 young voices singing in harmony, calling her forward to complete the task they had begun with such courage so long ago. The ride back to Henry's ranch took place in tense silence, with Victor Steele's truck maintaining its menacing presence in their rearview mirror. Joseph drove with the steady concentration of someone accustomed to being followed, taking indirect routes through back roads that wound through desert landscapes painted gold by the setting sun. Buck remained alert in the truck bed, his attention divided between the pursuing vehicle and the growing darkness that seemed to carry whispers from the abandoned town behind them. It wasn't until they were safely inside Henry's kitchen, with curtains drawn and doors locked, that Joseph finally shared the most shocking revelation of all. He placed Star That Falls' journal on the wooden table with the reverence reserved for sacred objects, then looked directly at Marigold with eyes that held both sorrow and determination. "There's something else you need to know," he said quietly. "Something my great-aunt made me promise to tell, only when I was certain the person hearing it could handle the full truth." Henry had been unusually quiet since their return, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had grown cold while he wrestled with his own demons. At Joseph's words, he looked up with an expression that suggested he suspected what was coming. "Go ahead," Henry said heavily. "She's already in too deep to turn back now." Joseph opened the journal to a page marked with an eagle feather, its surface covered in careful script that seemed to glow with importance under the kitchens. Warm lighting. The entry was dated December 15th, 1893, 5 days after the night that had destroyed Silver Creek. "Today, I buried my daughter in the cave where she died," Joseph read aloud, his voice thick with inherited grief. "Star that falls lived for. 3 days after we carried her from the town, but the wounds were too severe, the loss of blood too great. She spoke of Annie until the end, asking me to promise that someday their story would be told together, as their lives had been lived, in friendship that transcended the hatred others tried to force between our peoples." Marigold felt the world tilt around her as the implications hit home. Star that falls hadn't escaped to safety. She had died from injuries sustained during the violent night that drove her family from their home. But if that was true, then the mysterious presence Buck had sensed in Silver Creek, the whispers on the wind, the flickering lights in the darkness. "Both girls died that night," she whispered, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "Star that falls and Annie. They're both still there, aren't they?" Joseph nodded solemnly. "According to my great-aunt's account, their spirits have been bound to Silver Creek ever since. Annie died trying to protect Star That Falls, and Star That Falls died before she could properly honor her friend's sacrifice. Neither could find peace until someone came along who cared enough to learn their whole story and see justice done." Buck whined softly from his position by the kitchen door, his ears swiveling toward sounds beyond human perception. The night air outside carried the distant rumble of approaching vehicles, and Marigold felt her pulse quicken as she realized their safe haven was about to be compromised. "Company's coming," Henry observed grimly, moving toward the window to peer through. A gap in the curtains. What he saw made his face go pale. Victor Steele's truck was indeed approaching, but it wasn't alone. 2 additional vehicles followed behind it, expensive SUVs with tinted windows that suggested this was more than a casual visit. "Joseph, take Marigold and get out the back," Henry commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced dangerous situations before. "There's an old mining trail that leads up into the hills. Follow it until you reach the abandoned ranger station. Then—" "No," Marigold interrupted, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "I'm not running anymore. If Mr. Steele wants to talk, then we'll talk, but we do it with witnesses, and we do it with the truth." She pulled out her grandfather's old digital camera, a device Henry had taught her to use for documenting ranch work, and quickly began photographing the journal pages, the letters, and the treaty fragment. If something happened to the originals, at least the evidence would survive in digital form. The vehicles pulled up outside with the coordinated precision of a military operation. Car doors slammed in quick succession, followed by the sound of boots on gravel and low voices conferring about strategy. Buck's hackles rose to full alert, and even Joseph, who had maintained calm dignity throughout their investigation, looked genuinely concerned for the first time. Victor Steele's knock on the front door was sharp and demanding, lacking any pretense of social courtesy. When Henry opened it, Marigold could see that the businessman had abandoned his usual polished appearance in favor of work clothes and an expression that promised violence if his demands weren't met. "Evening, Henry," Steele said, pushing past him into the kitchen without invitation. "I think it's time we had a serious conversation about boundaries and consequences." Behind him came 2 men who were clearly not local ranchers. Their expensive suits and cold eyes marked them as the kind of professionals who made problems disappear for people wealthy enough to afford their services. They positioned themselves strategically around the kitchen, blocking exits while maintaining the illusion of casual conversation. "Mr. Steele," Marigold said, her voice steady despite the fear hammering in her chest, "I know what your family did to Star That Falls and Annie Patterson." Steele's artificial smile vanished entirely, replaced by an expression of naked calculation. "Is that so? And what exactly do you think you know, little girl?" I know your great-grandfather used false accusations to steal land from the Windwalker family. I know he organized a mob to drive them out of Silver Creek, and I know 2 children died because of his greed and hatred. You know stories, Steele replied dismissively. Old tales told by old people who weren't even there. Stories aren't evidence, and evidence is what matters in court. Marigold held up the camera, its display showing clear images of the historical documents they'd discovered. These aren't stories. They're legal documents, witness testimonies, and physical evidence that proves your family built their fortune on murder and theft. The change in Steele's demeanor was immediate and terrifying. The last vestiges of his businessman's facade crumbled, revealing something predatory underneath. He gestured to his men, who began moving closer with the coordinated menace of people accustomed to violence. That camera and those documents are going to disappear tonight, he said quietly, along with anyone who's seen them. But before his men could act, something extraordinary happened. The temperature in the kitchen dropped suddenly, as if winter had arrived without warning. Frost began forming on the windows despite the Nevada heat, and the overhead lights flickered with electrical disturbances that had no logical source. Buck began barking, not his usual warning bark, but something deeper and more primal, as if he was responding to presences that existed beyond normal perception. The kitchen filled with the sound of whispers in languages both ancient and familiar, and shadows began moving independently of the people who should have cast them. In the center of the room, 2 translucent figures materialized with startling clarity. One was a Native American girl with long, dark braids and eyes that held wisdom beyond her years. The other was a blonde girl whose determined expression matched the face in the silver locket. They stood hand in hand, their spirits united in death as their friendship had been united in life. Star That Falls and Annie Patterson had come to bear witness. Victor Steele's face went white with terror as the 2 girls looked directly at him, with eyes that held more than a century of accumulated justice. When Star That Falls spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had waited far too long to be heard. Cornelius Steele murdered us both, she said, her words ringing with supernatural clarity. He shot Annie when she tried to warn us, then led his mob to our family's hiding place. When we tried to protect our people's sacred objects, he struck me down with the same gun that killed my friend. Annie's spirit nodded, her own voice joining the terrible testimony. He took the silver my people had legally mined, claimed our land through forged documents, and built his fortune on our blood. Every dollar the Steele family has earned carries the stain of our murder. The supernatural manifestation was too much for Steele's hired men, who fled toward the door with the panic of people confronting forces beyond their understanding. But Steele himself seemed frozen in place, trapped by guilt that had been passed down through 5 generations. "You're not real," he whispered, though his voice shook with the terror of a man who knew otherwise. "We are as real as the crimes your family has hidden," Star That Falls replied. "As real as the land you stole, as real as the justice that has been denied for more than a century." Joseph stepped forward, his weathered hands steady as he began a chant in his ancestral language, words of power that seemed to give the spirits greater solidity and presence. The kitchen filled with the scent of sage and desert flowers, and somewhere in the distance Marigold could hear the sound of voices singing in harmony across the years. "The evidence will be preserved," Annie's spirit declared, looking directly at the camera in Marigold's hands. "The truth will be told, and the debts of the past will finally be paid." As suddenly as they had appeared, the 2 girls faded back into the spirit world, leaving behind only the lingering scent of wildflowers and the echo of their words. But their presence had accomplished what decades of threats and intimidation could not. Victor Steele's carefully maintained control had crumbled completely. He stood in the center of Henry's kitchen, a broken man who had finally been confronted by the consequences of his family's actions. The camera in Marigold's hands held not just photographs of historical documents, but digital proof of the supernatural testimony that no court would believe, but everyone present would never forget. "It's over, Victor," Henry said quietly. "Whatever power your family thought it had over this valley, whatever secrets you thought you could keep buried, it's all finished now." Steele looked around the kitchen as if seeing it for the first time, his eyes wild with the desperation of someone who realized his entire world was collapsing. When he spoke, his voice carried the hollow sound of defeat. "You don't understand what you've done. My family has invested everything in keeping this." "Quiet. There are people, powerful people, who have built their own fortunes on the foundation we created. If this comes out, justice finally gets served," Marigold interrupted, her courage strengthened by the knowledge that Star That Falls and Annie stood with her across the veil between worlds. "And 2 little girls who died. Protecting what they loved can finally find peace." As Victor Steele stumbled toward the door, his empire already crumbling in his mind, Marigold realized that her journey had transformed from childhood curiosity into something far more profound. She had become the voice for those who could no longer speak for themselves, the keeper of truths that needed to be told, and the instrument of justice that had been delayed for more than a century. The wooden doll in her pocket felt warm with approval, and the silver locket seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of a friendship that had survived death itself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, legal battles, and the complex work of setting historical records straight. But tonight, for the first time since 1893, Star That Falls and Annie Patterson knew that someone had finally heard their whole story and chosen to stand with them against the darkness that had tried to erase their memory. Buck settled beside Marigold with a contented sigh, his supernatural alertness finally relaxed. The guardian spirits had made themselves known, the truth had been revealed, and the long wait for justice had finally begun to end. Dawn broke over the Nevada desert with the kind of crystal clarity that comes after storms, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber that spoke of new beginnings. But the peaceful morning belied the chaos that Victor Steele's desperation had unleashed during the dark hours before sunrise. Marigold woke to the sound of Henry's voice on the phone, his words carrying the urgent edge of someone coordinating emergency responses. "Sheriff Morrison, yes, we need units out here immediately. They've got heavy equipment moving towards Silver Creek, and if they reach the town before we can stop them..." Marigold rushed to the kitchen window and felt her heart sink. In the distance, a convoy of construction vehicles was making its way across the desert toward her ghost town. Bulldozers, excavators, and dump trucks that could reduce Silver Creek's historic buildings to rubble within hours. Steele had clearly decided that if he couldn't buy the evidence of his family's crimes, he would simply destroy it. "They can't do that," she said, her voice tight with outrage. "It's my property. They don't have any right. Legal rights don't matter much when someone's desperate enough to commit crimes in broad daylight." Joseph observed grimly, his own phone pressed to his ear as he coordinated with tribal authorities and historical preservation groups. "But we're not without resources of our own." As if to emphasize his point, the morning air filled with the sound of approaching vehicles, but these were coming from the opposite direction. Sheriff's deputies, state police, and several unmarked cars that Marigold suspected contained federal agents were converging on the ranch with the coordinated efficiency of a well-planned operation. "I may have made a few calls last night, after our supernatural visitors departed," Henry admitted with a tired smile. "Turns out that when you have photographic evidence of historical crimes, forged land deeds, and ongoing criminal conspiracy, law enforcement becomes very interested very quickly." The lead vehicle belonged to Sheriff Patricia Morrison, a distant cousin of Henry's, who had inherited both the family name and the family sense of justice. She emerged from her patrol car with the purposeful stride of someone who had been waiting. Years for an excuse to take down Victor Steele's operation. "Henry, Marigold," she said by way of greeting, her attention already focused on the construction convoy visible in the distance. "We've got arrest warrants for Victor Steele and his associates on charges ranging from criminal trespass to destruction of historical sites. But we need to reach Silver Creek before they can complete whatever they're planning." Behind her came a small army of officials, FBI agents investigating interstate fraud, tribal police representing sovereign nation interests, historians from the Nevada State Museum, and reporters from newspapers who had caught wind that a major story was breaking in the desert. The peaceful ranch had transformed into a command center for what promised to be the largest law enforcement operation in the county's recent history. "The archaeological significance alone makes this a federal case," explained Dr. Sarah Martinez, the state's chief historian. "If those buildings contain evidence of the 1893 massacre, destroying them would constitute destruction of a crime scene, even one that's more than a century old." But it was the arrival of Rosa Clearwater that truly transformed the gathering from an official response into something that felt like a community uprising. The elderly Native American woman stepped out of a pickup truck driven by her grandson, her weathered hands carrying a bundle of sage, and her dark eyes blazing with the fire of someone whose family had waited 5 generations for this moment. "My grandmother was Star That Fall's cousin," she announced to the assembled crowd. "She told me stories about that terrible night, stories her family had to keep secret for fear of what the Steele family might do if they knew any witnesses had survived." Rosa's presence seemed to give official weight to what might otherwise have been dismissed as childhood ghost stories. The federal agents began taking statements, the historians started documenting evidence, and the reporters began crafting stories that would expose Victor Steele's criminal enterprise to national scrutiny. "Mrs. Clearwater," one of the FBI agents said respectfully, "we understand you may have information about ongoing criminal activity related to fraudulent land claims and historical cover-ups. Would you be willing to make an official statement?" "I've been waiting my whole life to make that statement," Rosa replied with quiet dignity. "My grandmother made me promise that someday, when it was safe, I would tell the world what really happened to our people in Silver Creek." As the morning progressed, Marigold found herself at the center of a whirlwind of official activity that seemed to have taken on a life of its own. The photographic evidence from her camera had been downloaded and distributed to multiple agencies. The historical documents Joseph had shared were being authenticated by experts who confirmed their legal significance, and most importantly, Rosa's testimony was providing corroborating evidence for crimes that most people had assumed were beyond prosecution due to their age. But even as law enforcement mobilized to protect Silver Creek, Marigold felt a growing sense that the real battle would be fought on a different level entirely. Buck had been restless all morning, his attention focused on something beyond human perception, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with supernatural tension. "They're gathering," Joseph observed quietly, following Buck's gaze toward the empty desert that stretched between the ranch and Silver Creek. "Star That Falls and Annie. They know this is the moment they've been waiting for. But supernatural justice and human justice don't always work the same way." The truth of his words became apparent as they prepared to leave for Silver Creek. The construction convoy had reached the ghost town and was beginning to set up equipment despite the approaching law enforcement response. But as the first bulldozer moved toward the historic buildings, something extraordinary happened. The machine simply stopped working. Its engine died without warning, and when the operator tried to restart it, nothing happened. The same mysterious malfunction affected every piece of heavy equipment simultaneously. Engines that had been running perfectly suddenly fell silent, as if some invisible force had drained them of power. "Equipment failure," Sheriff Morrison reported over her radio, though her voice carried the bewildered tone of someone who didn't believe her own words. All construction vehicles are experiencing simultaneous mechanical problems. Through binoculars, Marigold could see Victor Steele standing among the disabled machinery, his face twisted with rage and desperation as he screamed orders at workers who were clearly as baffled as everyone else. But she could also see something else, translucent, figures moving among the construction vehicles, their presence causing frost to form on metal surfaces despite the desert heat. "The spirits are protecting their town," she whispered, understanding flooding through her as she realized that Star That Falls and Annie were actively interfering with the destruction of their final resting place. The supernatural intervention bought precious time for the human authorities to reach Silver Creek. By the time the convoy of official vehicles arrived at the ghost town, they found Victor Steele's crew in full retreat, abandoning equipment they couldn't explain and couldn't restart. But Steele himself hadn't given up. As law enforcement surrounded him with arrest warrants, he pulled out a pistol, his great-grandfather's gun, Marigold realized with a chill, and pointed it directly at her. "This ends now," he snarled, his composure finally cracking completely. 5 generations of my family's success aren't going to be destroyed by a meddling little girl and her ghost stories. The standoff that followed seemed to stretch across eternity. Federal agents had their own weapons drawn, but they couldn't risk a shot with Marigold in the line of fire. Buck growled low in his throat, his muscles coiled for a protective leap that might cost him his life. And somewhere in the supernatural silence that had settled over Silver Creek, 2 young spirits prepared for a final confrontation with the evil that had destroyed their lives more than a century ago. "Mr. Steele," Sheriff Morrison said carefully, her own weapon trained on the desperate man, "you're surrounded by law enforcement officers and about a dozen witnesses with cameras. Whatever you're thinking of doing, it will only make things worse for you." "Worse?" Steele laughed bitterly. "My great-grandfather built an empire and I've spent my entire life protecting it. I'm not going to let it crumble because some dead Indians want their revenge." As he spoke, the temperature around Silver Creek began to drop precipitously. Frost formed on building surfaces, and the air filled with whispers in languages both ancient and familiar. The spirits of Star That Falls and Annie Patterson were manifesting with greater strength than Marigold had ever witnessed, their presence becoming visible even to those who had no supernatural sensitivity. The final confrontation between justice and greed, truth and concealment, was about to begin. The witness stone revealed itself in the most unexpected way, rising from the desert floor like a natural altar that had been waiting centuries for this moment. As the supernatural cold intensified around Silver Creek, the ground beneath the old church began to crack and shift, revealing a crystalline formation that caught and amplified the morning light until it blazed like a beacon of truth. Marigold stared in wonder as the stone emerged, not carved by human hands, but shaped by geological forces into something that resembled a massive crystal geode. Its surface was covered with natural patterns that seemed to tell stories, and its hollow center contained formations that gleamed like frozen fire. This was the sacred witness stone that Joseph's ancestors had spoken of in whispers, the place where truth could not be hidden and lies could not survive. "The earth itself bears witness," Joseph said in awe, his voice carrying the reverence of someone seeing prophecy fulfilled. "My great-aunt told me this stone would appear when justice finally returned to Silver Creek, but I never imagined—" His words were cut short by Victor Steele's desperate laughter. The man still held his great-grandfather's gun trained on Marigold, but his eyes had gone wild with the desperation of someone watching his entire world crumble. "More ghost stories and Indian superstitions," he snarled. "I don't care what kind of rock tricks you've arranged. I'm ending this now." But as Steele spoke, something extraordinary happened. The witness stone began to glow with inner light, and its crystalline surfaces started projecting images like a natural movie screen. The assembled crowd, law enforcement officers, historians, reporters, and ordinary citizens who had come to witness history, watched in stunned silence as the events of December 1893 played out before their eyes with supernatural clarity. They saw Cornelius Steele leading a torch-bearing mob through Silver Creek streets, his face twisted with greed and racial hatred. They witnessed Annie Patterson's desperate attempt to warn Star That Fall's family, her young voice calling out warnings that came too late. They saw the violent confrontation that followed, shots fired in darkness, buildings set ablaze, and two innocent children caught in the crossfire of adult hatred. Most horrifying of all, they saw the cold-blooded murder that had been covered up for more than a century. Cornelius Steele shooting Annie when she tried to protect her friend, then pursuing Star That Fall's family to their hiding place and striking down the young girl when she refused to reveal the location of sacred objects he wanted to steal. "That's not how it happened," Victor Steele shouted, but his voice cracked with the terror of a man confronted by undeniable truth. "My great-grandfather was protecting the community from thieves and savages. Your great-grandfather was a murderer." Star That Fall's voice cut through the desert air with supernatural clarity. The young girl's spirit materialized beside the witness stone, her presence so vivid that even the most skeptical observers could no longer deny what they were seeing. "And you carry the stain of his crimes in your blood and your bank account." Annie's spirit appeared beside her friend, the two girls holding hands as they had in life, united in death by a friendship that transcended racial boundaries and historical injustice. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of more than a century of denied justice. Every building in Silver Creek, every acre of stolen land, every dollar your family earned, it all belongs to Star That Fall's people by legal right and moral truth. The witness stone shows what really happened, and no amount of money or threats can change that reality. The crystal formation pulsed with increasing intensity, its projections becoming more detailed and impossible to dismiss as illusion or trickery. Federal agents began recording everything on digital devices, understanding that they were witnessing evidence that would revolutionize historical understanding and legal precedent. The reporters present were already crafting stories that would expose Victor Steele's family crimes to national scrutiny. But Victor Steele himself had moved beyond rational response. Confronted by supernatural testimony that destroyed his family's carefully constructed lies, he raised his great-grandfather's gun with the same murderous intent that had destroyed Silver Creek more than a century earlier. "I won't let dead Indians destroy everything my family built," he screamed, his finger tightening on the trigger. Buck launched himself forward with a protective snarl, his powerful body intercepting Steele's line of fire just as the weapon discharged. The brave dog's yelp of pain cut through the desert air like a knife, and Marigold screamed as she saw her faithful companion collapse with blood spreading across his golden fur. But Buck's sacrifice had accomplished its purpose. Federal agents immediately subdued Victor Steele, wresting the gun from his hands and forcing him to the ground with the efficiency of professionals who had dealt with armed suspects countless times. The immediate physical danger was over, but the spiritual reckoning was just beginning. The witness stone's glow intensified even further, and its projections shifted to show not just the crimes of the past, but their consequences extending through generations. The assembled observers watched in fascination and horror as the crystal revealed how the Steele family had used their stolen wealth to corrupt officials, silence witnesses, and build a criminal empire that extended far beyond Nevada's borders. 5 generations of conspiracy, FBI agent Catherine Walsh muttered, as she watched documented evidence of bribery, fraud, and intimidation spanning more than a century. This is going to rewrite the history of Western land development and expose corruption at levels we never imagined. As paramedics worked to stabilize Buck's injuries, Marigold knelt beside the witness stone, with tears streaming down her face. The crystal's glow seemed to respond to her presence, its projections shifting to show something that made her breath catch in her throat. Star that Falls and Annie, together in a place of light and peace, their friendship finally able to flourish without the shadow of violence and hatred that had cut their lives short. "Thank you," she whispered to the spirits of the two girls. "Thank you for waiting so long, for believing someone would finally listen to your story." The witness stone pulsed once more, its final projection showing Silver Creek as it had been, in its brief golden age. A community where different cultures lived and worked together in harmony, where children played in streets that echoed with laughter instead of gunfire, where the promise of America's frontier ideals had briefly taken root and flourished. Then the supernatural light faded, leaving behind only natural crystal formations, and the echo of justice finally served. But the evidence captured by dozens of cameras and recording devices would ensure that Star That Falls and Annie Patterson's story would never again be buried in silence and shame. As the paramedics worked frantically to stabilize Buck, something miraculous happened that would be talked about in Pine Valley for generations to come. The brave dog's wounds, which had seemed life-threatening just moments before, began to heal with supernatural swiftness. The bullet that had struck him seemed to dissolve like morning mist, and his labored breathing eased as invisible hands guided his recovery. Star That Falls and Annie knelt beside Buck in their spirit forms, their translucent hands glowing with healing energy as they repaid the loyalty he had shown in protecting their chosen advocate. The paramedics watched in stunned amazement as their patient's vital signs stabilized and his injuries closed before their eyes. "I've been doing this job for 20 years, one of them muttered to his partner, "and I've never seen anything like this. It's like the bullet just vanished." Buck opened his intelligent brown eyes and looked directly at the two spirit girls, his tail moving in a gentle wag that suggested he could see them as clearly as Marigold could. Star That Falls smiled and scratched behind his ears, her ghostly touch somehow registering as Buck leaned into the caress with obvious pleasure. "He has always been able to see us," Annie's spirit observed with fond amusement. "Animals understand that death is not an ending, just a different way of being present in the world." As Buck recovered with supernatural assistance, the legal consequences of Victor Steele's crimes were unfolding with devastating efficiency. Federal agents were already coordinating with prosecutors to file charges that would dismantle the criminal empire built on stolen land and covered up by generations of corruption. But it was Rosa Clearwater's arrival at the witness stone that transformed legal justice into something deeper and more healing. The elderly woman approached the crystalline formation with a bundle of sage and tobacco, her weathered hands steady. As she began the ceremony, her grandmother had taught her decades ago. Other tribal elders had arrived during the morning's chaos, called by news of the witness stone's appearance, and they formed a circle around the sacred site with the reverence, due to a place where truth had finally triumphed over lies. "Today we honor Star That Falls and Annie Patterson," Rosa announced, her voice carrying across the desert with ceremonial authority. "Two children whose friendship showed us what our communities could become when hatred is replaced by understanding, when fear is replaced by love." From her bag, Rosa withdrew an eagle feather that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light, the reconciliation feather that Joseph had mentioned, appearing at the moment when healing could finally begin. As she held it high, the assembled crowd felt a palpable shift in the atmosphere, as if decades of tension and buried shame were finally being released. The feather began to glow with the same supernatural radiance that had illuminated the witness stone, and its light seemed to heal more than just individual wounds. Law enforcement officers who had arrived expecting routine arrests found themselves moved to tears by the ceremony. Historians who had come to document evidence discovered they were witnessing the birth of a new understanding about Western development and indigenous rights. Reporters who had expected a simple crime story realized they were covering something that would reshape how America understood its own past. Most remarkably, Victor Steele himself seemed to be affected by the feathers. Healing influence. As federal agents prepared to transport him for arraignment, the man who had spent his life protecting criminal secrets began to speak with startling honesty about his family's crimes. "My father told me stories," he said, his voice hollow with the weight of inherited guilt. "He said our family's success came from taking opportunities others were too weak to seize. But I always knew there was blood on that money, blood that couldn't be washed clean no matter how much we spent on lawyers and politicians." Agent Walsh looked up from her documentation with professional interest. "Are you saying you're willing to cooperate with our investigation, Mr. Steele?" "I'm saying I'm tired of carrying lies that aren't mine," Steele replied, his gaze fixed on the reconciliation feather in Rosa's hands. "If that feather can heal wounds that are more than a century old, maybe it can heal the sickness in my family too." As Victor Steele was led away, no longer a threatening presence, but a broken man seeking redemption, the ceremony reached its spiritual climax. Star That Falls and Annie appeared one final time, their spirit forms more solid and radiant than ever before. They walked hand in hand to where Marigold knelt beside the witness stone, their young faces glowing with gratitude and peace. "The truth has been told," Star That Falls said, her voice carrying the joy of someone whose long burden had finally been lifted. "Our story will be remembered not for how we died, but for how we lived, in friendship that conquered hatred, in love that survived death itself." Annie nodded, her own spirit radiant with happiness. "The children who come after us will learn that different peoples can live together in harmony, that friendship is stronger than fear, that truth always finds a way to surface no matter how deep it's buried." The two girls embraced Marigold in a hug that felt warm and real despite their supernatural nature, then turned to wave goodbye to Buck, who barked once in acknowledgement of their parting. As they faded into the morning light, their spirits finally free to move beyond the earthly realm, the reconciliation feather in Rosa's hands burst into brief, brilliant flame, before crumbling into ash that the desert wind carried away like a blessing. The ceremony was complete. Justice had been served, healing had begun, and the long wait for reconciliation had finally ended. Silver Creek would never again be a place of secrets and sorrow. It would become a symbol of hope, a reminder that truth and friendship could triumph over even the deepest injustices, given time and courage, and someone willing to listen to voices that others had tried to silence forever. 6 months after the supernatural confrontation that changed everything, Silver Creek buzzed with life and purpose in ways its original residents could never have imagined. The ghost town had been transformed into a living memorial and educational center where visitors came not just to see preserved buildings, but to learn the complete truth about Western expansion, indigenous rights, and the power of friendship to transcend historical divisions. Marigold stood on the porch of the restored Silver Creek schoolhouse, now serving as the visitor center, watching a group of children explore the town with the wide-eyed wonder she remembered from her own first visit. At 9 years old, her birthday had passed quietly, while lawyers and historians worked to establish the memorial. She had become something unprecedented, the youngest director of a historical preserve in Nevada's history. Buck padded beside her, his golden fur gleaming in the afternoon sun and showing no trace of his supernatural healing 6 months earlier. The brave dog had become something of a celebrity himself, featured in newspaper articles about the miracle dog of Silver Creek, who had taken a bullet to protect a child and recovered through what reporters diplomatically called unexplained circumstances. "Miss Marigold," called out Mrs. Patterson, no relation to Annie, but a school teacher from Las Vegas who brought her 4th grade class to Silver Creek every month. "The children would love to hear the story again, if you have time." Marigold smiled and walked toward the group, her hands unconsciously checking for the wooden doll and silver locket she now wore every day. The artifacts had become symbols of her role as storyteller and guardian of memories that could never again be lost to silence and shame. "Gather around," she said, settling onto the steps of the schoolhouse where Star That Falls and Annie had once attended classes together. "Let me tell you about two girls who lived here long ago and how their friendship changed everything." As she began the familiar tale, Marigold marveled at how much had changed since that day when she'd impulsively bought a ghost town with her last $10. The federal investigation triggered by Victor Steele's arrest had exposed corruption, networks spanning multiple states and involving dozens of prominent families whose wealth traced back to similar land frauds. The legal settlements had restored millions of acres to their rightful owners and established fund for historical preservation and tribal education. Victor Steele himself had become an unlikely ally in the process of setting history straight. His cooperation with federal prosecutors had earned him a reduced sentence, and he now spent his time working with historians to document his family's crimes and help return stolen artifacts to their proper cultural contexts. The man who had once threatened violence to protect his secrets had found unexpected peace in telling the truth. "The most important thing to remember," Marigold told the visiting children, "is that Star That Falls and Annie showed us how people from different backgrounds can be friends, how understanding is more powerful than fear, and how truth always finds a way to surface if we're brave enough to listen." After the school group departed, Marigold walked through Silver Creek's restored buildings with the satisfaction of someone who had seen a vision become reality. The saloon now housed exhibits about mining life and multicultural communities. The general store had been converted into a research center where scholars studied the intersection of indigenous and settler cultures. The church served as a meditation space where people of all backgrounds could come to reflect on the lessons of the past. But it was the memorial garden behind the church that held special meaning for Marigold. Two small headstones marked the final resting places of Star That Falls and Annie Patterson, their remains having been recovered from the sacred cave system with full ceremonial honors. The garden surrounding their graves bloomed with wildflowers from both Native American and European traditions, creating a living symbol of the cultural harmony the two girls had represented. Grandpa Henry joined her at the memorial as the sun began to set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to echo the eternal friendship of the two children buried there. At 78, Henry had found new purpose in his role as volunteer historian, sharing stories about his own family's complicated relationship with Silver Creek's history. "Any regrets about spending that $10? He asked with gentle humor. Marigold considered the question seriously, looking out over a town that had been dead for more than a century and was now alive with learning, healing, and hope. "No regrets," she said finally. "Star That Falls and Annie waited so long for someone to hear their story. I'm glad it was me." Rosa Clearwater approached from the visitor center, her arms full of the day's mail and her face bright with the satisfaction of meaningful work accomplished. As cultural director of the Silver Creek Memorial, she had become the bridge between past and present, helping visitors understand not just what had happened here, but why it mattered for the future. "Letter for you, Marigold," Rosa said, handing her an envelope with the official seal of the Nevada State Historical Society. "I think it might be good news." The letter confirmed what Marigold had hoped for. Silver Creek had been designated as a National Historic Site, ensuring federal protection and funding for its continued operation as an educational center. More importantly, the designation recognized the memorial's unique mission of telling complete and honest stories about American expansion, including voices that had been systematically excluded from historical narratives. As evening deepened, over the desert, the three generations represented by Marigold, Henry, and Rosa stood together in comfortable silence, each reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment of peace and purpose. Buck settled beside them with a contented sigh, his intelligent eyes scanning the horizon with the alertness of a guardian who understood his watch was not yet over. In the distance, carried on the desert wind, they could hear the faint sound of children's laughter, not from any living visitors, but from spirits at play in a place where joy had finally replaced sorrow. Star that falls and Annie had moved on to whatever comes after, but their presence lingered in Silver Creek as a blessing rather than a haunting, a reminder that love and friendship could indeed conquer hatred and fear. The new town charter hung, framed in the visitor center, signed by representatives from federal, state, tribal, and local governments, establishing Silver Creek as a place where all voices would be heard and all stories would be honored. It was a document that would have been impossible 6 months earlier, when powerful interests had preferred silence and forgetting to truth and healing. But perhaps most importantly, the charter bore the signatures of the community members who had chosen courage over comfort, who had stood with Marigold when it would have been easier to turn away from inconvenient truths. Mrs. Henderson from the library, Joseph Crow Feather, Sheriff Morrison, and dozens of others who had proven that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they chose to listen to voices that others had tried to silence. As the desert stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Marigold felt a deep sense of completion settling over her like a comfortable blanket. The wooden doll in her pocket no longer pulsed with supernatural urgency. It now carried only the warm memory of a friendship that had changed the world. The silver locket around her neck had become a symbol of hope rather than sorrow, proof that love could survive even the deepest injustices. "Time to head home, little sparrow," Henry said gently, using the nickname that had carried her through the darkest moments of their investigation. As they walked toward their truck, Buck trotting ahead with the confident stride of a dog who knew his purpose in the world, Marigold took one last look at Silver Creek. The building stood strong and proud in the starlight, no longer empty shells haunted by tragedy, but living monuments to the power of truth and the possibility of redemption. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new opportunities to share the story of 2 brave girls whose friendship had waited more than a century to be properly honored. There would be more research, more discoveries, more chances to bridge the gaps between past and present, between different communities and cultures. But tonight, Silver Creek rested in peace, watched over by the spirits of children who had finally found justice and guarded by the living who had chosen to be worthy of their sacrifice. The ghost town had become something far more precious than Marigold could ever have imagined when she'd spent her last $10 on what everyone else considered worthless. It had become proof that even the smallest acts of courage could change the world, and that friendship was indeed the most powerful force in human experience. As they drove away into the star-filled Nevada night, the lights of Silver Creek Memorial glowed behind them like a beacon of hope, calling to all who would come seeking truth, understanding, and the kind of healing that can only happen when we finally choose to listen to the voices that history tried to silence forever.